Dear friends, beside organizing Brain Bar and doing some other stuff, I try to read 60 to 80 books a year, mostly science. I inherited this passionate curiosity about science from my father. I'm fascinated not only by the hypotheses and the numbers, but also the people behind them. This year, especially for Brain Bar, for a number of reasons. First of all, we are the biggest on record, thanks to you. Also, we have the most prominent headliners so far. But on top of all that, it's also special for me personally. It's extra special because my absolute personal favorite is with us. For a science lover, that's a pretty amazing thing, imagine that. The person I'm about to introduce to you is a true global giant. He worked at the Los Alamos laboratory, you know, the one from the pages of the history books from last century, and also the film Oppenheimer. He taught at Stanford, the best university in life sciences, and served as president of a place called the Santa Fe Institute. That's one of the very few places where social scientists and natural scientists working together to solve humanity's biggest problems. The famous American magazine, the Rolling Stone, called them a Justice League for renegade geeks. 10 years ago, at the very first Brain Bar, we had a very important speaker as well, historian Niall Ferguson, also world famous. Well, Ferguson himself said of tonight's guests, he's probably the smartest living person in the world. Who is this mysterious gentleman? He's a person who discovered the universal law that explains how biological organisms, cities and companies rise and fall. The law that holds sway over life and death on planet Earth. Given all that, how could he not be my favorite? Well, actually, I don't love him for those things alone. I love him because he's unbelievably modest and kind, a fantastic company, someone you can talk to and never forget that conversation for the rest of your life. Dear friends, Geoffrey West.
Good day. Good to see you. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I've enjoyed the time and the talks I've heard. So, hidden laws, I'm going to take a physicist's perspective, and I probably don't need to remind you that physics has had this extraordinary profound effect upon all our lives, upon the planet. I mean, all our technology is derived from the underlying physical laws and understanding the processes by which everything, so to speak, works, including, indeed, the universe. It's kind of amazing, actually, that we have a credible, serious theory of the evolution of the universe, from the Big Bang through to the formation of galaxies, planets, and the Earth, and so on. And it's sort of amazing, but in a way, what is equally amazing is that, first of all, we understand there's an exponentially expanding universe, but that we don't understand almost anything that goes on this planet, including things like this, all this mess that exists on the one place in the universe about which the laws of physics struggle to understand and to make a deep understanding of how these work in detail as well as in general. And so we have this curious situation that things like this seem to indicate that here we're living in the most complex place in the universe, including the universe itself. What I'm going to try to do is to show you that underlying all the messiness that exists on the planet, there lies some extraordinary regularity, and that despite the fact that everything seems chaotic, arbitrary, and capricious at times, there is this extraordinary underlying simplicity which we see and exploit in making things like airplanes and iPhones and so on, and in which we see in the workings of the universe itself, but in contrast to understand that there are also laws underlying these highly complex systems which have this distinctive quality that they're evolving and adapting continuously to external changes and all the kinds of things that we're all familiar with. All these systems have multiple levels of organizations. The ones I showed you, that we're going from molecules all the way up to organisms, to ecosystems, and so on. But all of this has to work in unison. It's all integrated, and it's all co-evolved together. Indeed, one of the most amazing things about it is that it sustains itself. I mean, it's continually changing, but life has been around for 2 to 3 billion years. I've been around for almost 85 years, which is kind of amazing. And somehow all this is working. And for that to happen, one can speculate there must have been laws underlying it, things that control it and constrain them. And that all happens, and this is what I want to tell you about, through networks, through the structure and dynamics and processes that take place on networks, of which you're very familiar, these kinds of networks in our lives, but the networks that underlie our lives, in biological sphere. So some years ago, myself, working with some biologists, formulated some generic principles for these networks. And I'm not going to go through this. I'm just going to, the thing I want to emphasize is that they are principles. They transcend the design of the organisms. They follow from natural selection. And here's the most important thing, a huge assumption that the whole process of natural selection, the competition, the survival of the fittest, has led to systems that have tended towards being optimized. So that, for example, the circulatory system that we all share and that we share with every single mammal that has ever existed on this planet has evolved to minimize the amount of energy your heart has to do to pump blood through that system to supply energy and resources to your cell so that you can live. So you minimize it in order to maximize the amount of energy you can devote to what's called Darwinian fitness, meaning to the propagation of offspring. So that's the idea, and you have to put that into mathematics. And when you do all that, so I'm not going to show you any of this, this leads to something that is also extraordinary, to a very simple scaling law, so-called scaling law, and this is for the most fundamental quantity of life, metabolic rate. How much food you need to stay alive. And this is plotted on the vertical axis of the metabolic rate, on the horizontal axis is the size of animal. This is for a bunch of animals, and what you see when it's plotted this way, logarithmically, meaning you go up by factors of 10, 0, 1, 10, 100. If I did 1, 2, 3, and so on, the mouse and the elephant would be separated by here to the other side of Budapest. So you need to put them on a logarithmic scale. What is exposed by this is something unbelievably simple underlying the most complex phenomenon in the universe, namely metabolism. And what we see is this very simple straight line, and the straight line has a very simple slope. 3/4, it turns out. This has been known for almost 100 years. It's called Kleiber's law. Being less than 1 is called sublinear, and I will use that term a little bit later. And sublinear means also that there's an economy of scale. The bigger you are, the less you need per cell to stay alive. I mean, naively, you would expect to double the cells, double the amount of energy you need, but it isn't. Double the cells, you only need about 75%. So you save the bigger you are, and I'll come to that in a minute. So this permeates all of life. Here it is across different organisms. Here it is at cells. Here it is for plants and trees. And here it is for ecosystems. And it also leads, this idea of networks, to the idea that these systems, as part of the optimization, are self-similar fractals. They keep repeating themselves. If you cut off one piece and take it away, it looks like a little version of the thing that you've taken it from. So the extraordinary thing is, it's not just metabolic rate, but anything that you can measure about organisms, any of their physiology, any of their life history. That's the one I just showed you, metabolic rate. But here's others. I'm not even going to tell you what they are. Anything that you can think of, there's DNA in mitochondria, there's length, heights of trees, the radius of your aorta, how long you live, everything. They all have this simple phenomenon. When you plot them logarithmically, they're simple straight lines, but even more amazing, they all have slopes proportional to 1/4. So 4, all that stuff out there is constrained and controlled by the number 4 in some curious way. And the theory explains that. It comes out of the network dynamics and so on. So this permeates all of life, and it has all kinds of amazing consequences. So despite all of this, we have this unification and this hidden underlying constraint of life, regularity. And just to give you a sense, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what that implies. So an elephant has about 10,000 trillion cells, 10 to the 16th cells. And a mouse, if you take all those cells and make them into mice, you'd have 20,000 of them, roughly. Okay? So here's what's amazing. Because of that nonlinear behavior of metabolic rate controlled by these networks, an elephant requires 20,000 food calories a day to stay alive only, whereas those mice, the equivalent number of mice, require 500,000. So there's this extraordinary economy of scale the bigger you are, and this leads to other very important consequences, because the bigger you are, if you need less energy per cell, you're creating less damage per cell. Therefore, big animals systematically will live longer following this 1/4 kind of law. Not only that, if less damage is being done, they need to sleep less. I don't know how many people in this room know how long an elephant sleeps. Elephant sleeps 3 to 4 hours a night, and a mouse sleeps about 16. So the mouse is creating a lot of damage in a very short time, elephants very little, and whales sleep about 2. Here's that dependence. I've drawn the graph here. Here's the graph. That's us, mammals, and that, I don't think you can see it there, the circle. It agrees with the theory that it's very close to the 1/4, but it has also an amazing consequence. So here's that graph. Heart rates, in the theory, decrease as mass to the 1/4. Hearts slow down, time slows down the bigger you are. So if you multiply these two together, you multiply the decrease of heart rate by the increase of lifespan, one cancels the other. So heart rate times lifespan doesn't change, whether you're a shrew that lives on the palm of my hand or a blue whale that's bigger than this building. What is that? That's the number of heartbeats in a lifetime. So a shrew may live 1 to 2 years, and a whale 125 years, but they have roughly the same number of heartbeats, about 1.5 million. So it's kind of an intriguing, almost spiritual observation that all these things are scaled in a way so that everybody sort of lives the same kind of life history and the same kind of physiology and so on. So there it is more explicitly. So what about growth? Another consequence of this. So how does growth work? Well, you eat, you metabolize, you send the metabolic energy through your networks to the cells. And what happens at the cellular level? You repair damage that's done. You grow, you replace dead cells with new cells, and you grow new stuff. So there's an equation you can sort of write down. I'm not writing the mathematics. The supply, your metabolic energy, what you're eating, goes to maintain and some to growth. Supply grows slower than linearly, but maintenance, the demand, is linear. And linear always beats the sublinear, so that inevitably you slow down and you stop growing. So inevitably you have this, what's called sigmoidal growth, you stop growing. And so you can predict how every animal grows, and also how big it will be. So you can, that bounded growth, the fact that growth is destined to stop, plays a crucial role in the sustainability of the planet, and I will come back to this a little bit later. The fact that most of life spends its state in a metastable condition, like we do. We only grow for the first 15 to 20 years, and then, except for adding stuff around the middle, we pretty much stay the same size throughout our life until we die. So here they are. You can predict it for any animal. And what's also very lovely about it is that the theory tells you how to rescale all of these so they all look the same. So I'm not going to do that in detail. I'm just going to show you a graph that rescales growth, the size, versus how the time, a rescaled time. And if you look through the right lens, and here's the point I want to emphasize, everybody is growing at the same way, appropriately rescaled according to very simple equations. In the same way that you can argue that everybody lives the same length of time if you rescale accordingly, and you could do it by measuring heartbeats. Everybody lives the same length, whether you're tiny or big. Here's a summary of what I've said. We have these nonlinear scaling laws dominated by this quarter power. They express an economy of scale. the pace of life slows down the bigger you are. You grow sigmoidally, meaning you grow quickly and then stop, and then you die. And I'm not going to explain. The theory can explain all this, and all of it comes from the organization, dynamics, and structure of these networks. So I now want to move into the anthroposphere, us. So go away from the biosphere, biological life, to us, who separated ourselves about 10,000 years ago. And we've separated ourselves again, even a little bit from our early ancestors, because we formed something I'd like to call the urbanosphere, because, of course, most of us live in cities. So here's a photograph taken by a NASA satellite before 1820 at night. Of course, it sees nothing. This is my... There's nothing there to see because the Industrial Revolution had just begun. A few years later, you start to see lights. And 100 years later, which I chose because this is the year I was born, you really see lights. And 85 years later, 80 years later in this case, they really lights up. Now, of course, you know what that is. These are night lights of cities. But what is that? That's actually the surface of the planet burning, of course, because where do those night lights come from? They come from the generation of electricity from fossil fuels stored in the surface of the planet. So this is really what it's about, where it's just the surface of the planet burning. So obviously we're going to have climate change and so on and so forth. So just to give a sense of the rate at which this has been happening, we are now urbanizing at a rate of well over 1 million, some people say 2 million, every week on this planet. And that's equivalent to adding an entire New York metropolitan area every few months. If you look around yourself in Budapest, it's like there's another Budapest on this planet, the equivalent to Budapest, in about a week and a half. And a week and a half later, there's another one. And a week and a half after that, there's another Budapest. And that's what's happening now. And just again, to give you a sense of that, this is a kind of neat graph. That top green line is the amount of biomass on the planet from 1900 to 2020. And you see it's pretty constant. But those graphs at the bottom, those ones rising, are the amount of junk that we produce. Everything. From this building to this, to all your iPhones, to your garbage bags, your automobiles, everything, all been added up. Just a year or two ago, around about now, they're equal. That is, we've now produced as much junk, we are producing as much junk as the entire biosphere, which is a little bit frightening, just to give a sense of what's happening. So, everybody sort of knows we live in an exponentially expanding universe, but most people don't recognize we're living not just in an exponentially expanding socioeconomic universe, but a faster than exponentially expanding socioeconomic universe, us, right at this moment. And there it is. That's a picture. I'm sure you're familiar with this. This is the world population from when we started this process about 12,000 years ago, when we learned language, when we developed language, we discovered agriculture, we then formed sedentary kind of living, communities, cities, and so on. And we had this gradual increase, of course, until about 200-odd years ago, when we discovered and exploited fossil fuels, and at the same time discovered, so to speak, and developed entrepreneurism, capitalism, and free markets, and so on, which has been, those two together have been so unbelievably successful and led to the remarkable sort of quality and standard of life everybody in this room, certainly, I'm sure, is privileged to participate in, and it's been fantastic. And the question I'm going to lead up to now is, where is this going to take us? What does this mean? Where does it come from? A little bit. So, these are all the other metrics that you can measure about the planet. There's socioeconomic ones on the left, and those on the, you probably can't read them where you are, maybe not. But anyway, all these various things, they all go in the same way. They all look this huge hockey stick, of course, following population. Now, if you're a physicist and you see a curve like that, you're immediately reminded of a curve like this. So what is this? This is called the specific heat or heat capacity. This happens to be propane. So this is just the amount of heat that you need to raise 1 kilogram of propane by 1 degree. And you can see what happens as you increase temperature. It gradually, you need more and more heat. And then you come to a point where you need an enormous amount more, and it goes quickly up. And then if you keep adding heat, it collapses, it goes down, and so on. And you know exactly what's happening, I'm sure. On the left, you have a liquid, and on the right, you have a gas. And what this is called a phase transition in physics, or colloquially a tipping point, or a singularity, because this point here is effectively almost going to infinity, and that denotes something we call a singularity. It's tempting to look at this and think it is just like this, and in fact, mathematically, they're identical. Can't tell the difference mathematically between those two curves, that and that. And the question is the other side of that coming very soon, and it means collapse. So that's what I'm going to try to do the rest of the talk, but I need to do some stuff beforehand. And the first thing to recognize, which we've already said, the future of the planet lies with cities. So we're all familiar with cities. Hey, that's you. I took a picture. That's you. You know, all these wonderful things that cities are, all these things. So here's this extraordinary machine, truly the most extraordinary machine we've invented, because what it does, it creates wealth, creates knowledge, it innovates, and by so doing increases the standard and quality of living for everybody. So it's fantastic. But you can't do that for nothing. I'm sure everybody here is familiar with the most fundamental law of the universe, the one that supersedes everything, and that is the second law of thermodynamics, which says when you do all these wonderful things, shitty things have to happen. Namely, entropy is produced, inevitably things that you don't want. If you create order, you necessarily create a certain amount of disorder. And that's called entropy. So you create all those wonderful things, but you also create things like this. May not be specifically these, wherever you are, but things like this are inevitable. And the challenge is to minimize this, or to do ones that you can live with in some way. So all of these are following are like this. So all of these you're familiar. And you don't want Budapest to look like this. And you want London to look like this. So this is the thing that we're fighting. So all of these things, the other thing to recall is that, or to recognize, is that all these things that I've talked about, the good, the bad, and so on, are all actually interconnected. You can't treat one without it somehow affecting the other, although often it's very hard to see that. But one of the things you learn when you investigate complex systems is that you diddle something here, something happens over here. So you have this is a stupid little joke, but here's an example of unintended consequences that in some form or another we're all familiar with. This is the kind of thing that you have to be wary of if you only worry about one thing. Okay, so cities, and I'm not going to have time here to talk about companies, but they're quintessentially these complex adaptive systems. They're continually changing to external conditions and so on. And they contain these two parts. On the one hand, their infrastructure, their physicality, on the one hand, which is to do with energy and resources and so on. And that has to be integrated and is often in tension with information exchange, which is this kind of thing that's been going on here for the last couple of days. And is invoked, of course, in things like genomics and our brains and innovation and social networks and so forth. First question, when you start thinking about this from this paradigm, this perspective, is are cities scaled versions of one another? Now, I don't know much about, I'm afraid, I'm embarrassed to say, I don't know much about the urban system of Hungary. But so the question is, are there sort of hidden laws of cities, to begin with, that are like the hidden laws of biology that I discussed earlier? Well, cities are network systems, not just physical networks, but most importantly, it turns out, are social networks, the networks that you're participating right now, interacting with each other and across groups and so forth. And those networks have properties. They have to be we all have to be in some place at some time, and we all live in a kind of modular structures. We're part of families, we're part of groups, and so on. So all of this sort of has to be put into the pot and thought about in terms of what you're doing. But the thing to recognize is that cities, as distinct from the rest of biology, is this very tight integration between these two kinds of networks. And that's illustrated by this picture. What's going on in the middle has built into it the fact of place, and a place that's been there for a very long time, but with interactions that are taking place. And A is talking to B is talking to C talks back to A, and they're continually producing ideas. That's what's been happening here in spades in the last couple of days. All of the ideas created, probably 99.99%, are useless and pointless. But what is extraordinary about this process is that every once in a while, it produces a theory of relativity. It produces quantum mechanics. It produces Google. It produces Amazon. But it is this process, this continuous positive feedback process, that we all participate in. So you have to stipulate network principles for these kinds of networks. Look at number 4 there. The important thing is what is being optimized. So cities, in many ways, evolved to optimize, to facilitate and encourage more and more interactions, and at the same time minimize times to get from A to B. That's the kind of thing that you have to put into the theoretical framework that's developed, and that leads, as in biology, to these very simple scaling laws. Again, these logarithmic plots. Here, the horizontal axis is population, the size of the city. The vertical axis, in this case, happens to be something mundane, the number of petrol stations. And you can see they scale pretty well, and they scale like in biology. They're sublinear, that dotted line is linear. The only difference is that the slope is 0.85 instead of 0.75. But the important thing is, this just happens to be 4 European cities, 4 European countries, but it's true across the globe. Look at Argentina, Brazil, China, Japan, Australia, all look like this, and they all have basically the same slope, roughly at 0.85. Even more amazing, this is just petrol stations. But the length of all the roads, the length of all the electrical lines, the number of buildings, and all the rest, all the infrastructure scales just like this with the same slope pretty much across the globe. That's the physical side. What about the social, informational side? This positive feedback means that you're continually building on each other. We are building on each other always. And that leads, instead of sublinear scaling, where the bigger you are, the less per capita, it leads to something called superlinear scaling. The bigger you are, the more per capita, because you're continually building by this positive feedback process. And instead of the pace of life slowing down, so the elephant being ponderous and the mouse jittering around, the pace of life increases. So you have these two sort of complementary things to what's happening in biology. And here's the data. But this is data of various socioeconomic metrics of various things around the globe. There's things like divorces in Sweden, patents in the US, restaurants in Holland. But just by eye, you can see they're all basically the same slope, and they're all roughly 1.15. What does that mean in English? I can't say it in Hungarian, I'm afraid. But what it means is that if you double the size of a city within an urban system, then systematically, on the average, you save about 15%, which is what I said earlier, on all the infrastructure, but you gain 15% on all socioeconomic activity, income, wealth, ideas, patents, colleges, creative people, whatever, police, but also crime, disease, and so on. So the good, bad, and the ugly all come along together. Why? Because they all come about from social networks and social interaction. They all increase by this 15%. And just to check it, we teamed up with our buddies from MIT, and we measured social interactions, and there it is. And how did we do it? Well, you all carry this little detector, an iPhone with you, a cell phone with you, and we got a hold of all this billions and billions of the phone calls and analyzed them to measure how the number of interactions between people. I'm going to go into details on that, but you can see, just by eye again, this is the connectivity between people as a function of city size, and it looks less like all these other metrics. So the last part is to take this to the entire planet. So we talk about cities. Now, if I'd said this maybe even 30 years ago, 25, 30 years ago, or 50 years ago, it's kind of bonkers to think of the planet as basically a homogeneous entity, like you could think of a city. I mean, after all, we think of Budapest, even though it's inhomogeneous, you can treat it almost as one thing. But how about the planet? Well, until recently, that would not have made much sense, but in the last certainly 25 to 50 years, and certainly most recently, it's become truly urbanized, and it's been urbanized, whether we like it or not just by the usual phenomenon of trade and so on, but of course by the internet and all of social media and everything else. But that's a question, is it? So if it is one entity, then one of the predictions of this whole idea, since it's all a network theory, is that we should see scaling, simple scaling, and it should be superlinear. It should be bigger than, the slope should be bigger than 1. Okay, so there's the data. This is the global data on some major metrics. This is energy, GDP, and water use. You can see it's pretty good. That's the scaling as the function of the, logarithmically plotted as a function of the world population as it increased. And it follows it, and you can see at the top there, the slopes are all bigger than 1. So this is evidence that the world really is interconnected. It's one in a very sort of coarse-grained way of thinking. We're all interconnected in one big network. And now I want to do the same thing I did when I talked about biology. That is, we're going to talk about its growth. How does that work? Well, you have the metabolic rate, which is now our social metabolic rate, which is this thing increasing superlinearly. And that goes towards maintaining everything that we have and growing new stuff, growing new people, growing new buildings, growing new ideas, whatever. So that sounds daunting, but you can actually do quite a bit with it. But because one of the things that we know is that here's the thing I showed for metabolic rate. And by the way, what you can see is that if you looked carefully, your metabolic rate as you sit here is a little less than 100 watts. You're, well, not one of these, you're an old incandescent light bulb. That's all you use. 2,000 food calories a day is the light bulb. That's what you are. Unbelievably efficient. But of course, that's not who you are. That's who you were 10,000 or so years ago. Now you've got all this stuff with you. You carry with you iPhones. You have a bit of a refrigerator with you. You have part of an airline with you. You have all this stuff in order to be you. You have all this baggage which defines us. There's no such thing as an individual that doesn't have any. We have all this stuff. And if you add all that stuff in, instead of being 100 watts, you're 11,000 watts. You're 100 times bigger than your basal metabolic rate, and your equivalent, each person in this room is equivalent to something close to 30,000 kilograms in terms of the equivalent size of an animal you are that needs of the order of 10,000 watts, or about a dozen elephants. So that's who we are. So even though they say there are 8 billion individuals on the planet, actually there's really 1 trillion in terms of the biosphere. There's 1 trillion of us, roughly. Since we have this social metabolic rate that's bigger than 1, now we have this problem, or this wonderful thing, actually, open-ended growth, because now the metabolic rate beats the demand. Supply overwhelms demand because it's growing faster than linearly, and the demand is approximately linear. So we have this phenomenon, instead of growing and then stopping, we continue to grow, and that's what we have. So the theory is great. Theory predicts superlinear scaling. Superlinear scaling leads to open-ended growth, and you compare it with the data, and it works extremely well, and that's great, except it has a fatal flaw. It gives very good predictions for this and for all of these, but it also leads to something we call a finite time singularity, because it says something bonkers. It says if you keep going, you will reach, for any of these social metrics, an infinite number in a finite time. You can't have an infinite GDP. You can't have an infinite number of patents. You can't have an infinite number of AIDS cases. And the theory tells you what happens. It says you stagnate, and then you start to depopulate, and collapse. The system will collapse. And the way we got around it, of course, is by changing the paradigm and starting over again, because you realize you've done all this assuming everything's the same. We're in the Bronze Age. Bronze dominates. The Iron Age. Whatever. We're in the computer age. We discover coal. We have the Internet age. It sets the entire background for everything we do in terms of our culture and our socioeconomic activity. So you start over again. You have to make a major innovation in a systematic way in order to have open-ended growth. So if we want to keep growing, we have to do that, and that's what we've done. And there's data to prove, to show it. I'm not going to show you those. That's great, but you pay a heavy price. You have to do it faster and faster. So the time to the, if you made a major innovation, the time to the next one has to come quicker than the one before, and the one after that has to come even quicker in a systematic, predictable way, and that's what this data verifies, that it's happened, and don't have time to go into it. And the theory then predicts that a nice test of what's happening as we speak, that is, it says, if you plot, again, logarithmically, one of these socioeconomic metrics for the planet and plot it against the time to the next singularity, you should get a straight line. That's what it predicts, and it predicts what the slope of that line is, and that's what it's done here. I don't have time to go into details, but you can see it, and it tells you that we are going to hit a singularity in the next somewhere between 10 and maybe 30 years. It's hard to, the data isn't good enough to be more precise. I don't want to go into that in any detail. So just to summarize what I said, we have this unbounded growth. It's predicted. It's verified by the data. It leads to a finite time singularity. You have to innovate faster and faster. And the whole of life is accelerating faster and faster. And yet we're the same as we were 12,000 years ago when we were hunter-gatherers. And that's one of the big issues. And finally, and so the question is that sustainable? Are we all just on this treadmill that's going faster and faster? Or are we Sisyphus pushing the rock up and it rolls down again? Regardless, I'd like to finish with one of the great Hungarians, truly great man, John von Neumann, who made this extraordinary statement in 1953. The ever-accelerating progress of technology gives the appearance of approaching some essential singularity in the history of the race beyond which human affairs as we know them could not continue. And so I'd like to think, especially being in Budapest, that I've sort of skimmed the surface and added a little flesh to this prescient, what I consider prescient statement of von Neumann. So I'll finish there, other than showing, I'm shameless advertising for my book, and to say that actually all these wonderful, beautiful people did all the work. And also, there was great fun.
I was thinking how to follow up after your presentation, and I just thought, why shouldn't I start with an argument against the smartest guy on the planet? So you have this idea about size, and the bigger the size, the more the existential security or the lifespan. So how does it explain the very curious phenomena of 1,000-year-old Japanese companies under 20%? So I don't know how many of you know this, but almost 9 out of 10 of the oldest companies of the planet are Japanese companies. All of them are small, and they survived a millennia, 1,000 years.
Yes, in fact, in my book, I actually wrote about that because I was very intrigued by exactly that point. And by the way, it used to be the oldest company, whose name I've sadly forgotten, was this Japanese company. It was founded in something like 585. It survived until about 10 to 15 years ago, from 585 to about 2015, which is kind of amazing. I mean, it too eventually died. And a kind of interesting question for the audience, I would tell, is what the hell did it do that it could survive that long, and yet it would die in 2015? It's quite interesting. I'll come back to that in a minute because I want to try to answer your question. Okay. The companies that last very large lengths of time are either two kinds. One is they change. They do what life does, biology does. They adapt to the changing conditions and change even their products and their markets and so on. and they can last
So
much
after a
longer.
certain time, they are not the same company anymore?
Yeah, exactly. So they're effectively not the same company anymore.
Like Nintendo?
Sorry?
Like Nintendo?
Yeah, for example,
Or
exactly. Or IBM, for example. The other is exactly the opposite, which is what most of these Japanese companies are. They do exactly the same thing, but it's in such a tiny niche market, there's almost no competition, and they do it extraordinarily well. So many of those companies are either, well, I call them hotels, they're inns, or they might brew a special kind of beer or sake, and so on. So the speciality of the company, what used to be the oldest company in the world, it built monasteries, Japanese Zen monasteries. And that was fine for a long time, but unfortunately for them, and maybe unfortunate for Japan, they, after the Second World War, the culture changed dramatically after the occupation by the Americans, and people were much less interested, as they are globally, of course, in religion and churches and monasteries and so on. And unfortunately for this company, they weren't able to adapt, so they eventually chucked it. And it was the same family, by the way, it was the same family. That's the other aspect of these companies. They're typically single-family companies.
So according to this, what would be your single most important advice for those of the members of the audience who are about to start a company, a startup?
One of the things, of course, I come from this, you've heard me talk, and I come as a physicist, and I come from a kind of science-dominated way of thinking. And one of the things I discovered, first of all, about the work that's done on the companies, but also anecdotally talking to leaders of major companies, is that there's very little science in it. So I would strongly advise anyone beginning a company or some kind of startup really understands the science of companies, because it's not arbitrary and capricious. I mean, that's the whole point of this talk, is that even though this looks, it's sort of everything out there looks like it's arbitrary and capricious, underlying all of that what looks like messiness, are these laws at work. They're constraining how things can be. And so know what it can be for a company that you're trying to create, and of the size that you want to create it with and project it into the future. The other thing, which doesn't come from any expertise I have, is to ask, what are you creating this company for? In the sense, not just what is the product, but is it purely for profit? Is it purely for to be able to sell it down the line and make a lot of money that way? Or is it because you have social conscience, you want to do good, and so on? And I think that's really important. And I think one of the things that, if we're going to save the planet, one of the mindsets that needs to change, and it has changed and is changing to some degree, is a change of integrating the profit motive, which is obviously primary, with a deeper sense of social responsibility and social consciousness. That's a very delicate and difficult issue, but I think that's really important. The last thing, as a humanist, is because the companies that I've thought work well, that I know, and I don't know any company really well because you can't see the whole company, is treat people well. Now I know counterexamples to that, very, very good counterexamples of people whose names I shall not mention, who are exceedingly wealthy people, who do not treat their people they work for well. But somehow I feel that in the long run, that's an important attribute, and an attribute of companies.
Two more questions from me, and then the floor is yours. So you worked in places like Los Alamos, Stanford, Santa Fe Institute, a lot of other places. Who is the most remarkable individual you have ever encountered, and what made them unforgettable for you?
Oh my God. I should tell you, Gege was very sweet. He sent me some questions that he might ask, and I looked at them, and most of them I thought, okay, I'll just do it. This one, which is a very simple and a standard question, actually, sort of, really got me thinking. It got me thinking about what remarkable was, actually. But obviously it's in the eyes of the beholder, But what was remarkable? I mean, you are a remarkable person. You're one of the more...
Maybe you'll cut it out from the...
No, it is. You've created all this. You do all these things. It's fantastic. So you're remarkable. And then you would go down in my list of remarkable people, actually, for sure.
Thank you.
Most remarkable. So here's one of the things I have learned. I've met and interacted with people that are quite famous, actually, and whom I admire and respect in many ways because of what they've done.
Couple of Hungarians as well.
Sorry?
A couple of Hungarians as well.
A couple of Hungarians, for sure. But what I have discovered, and this is what gives me the problem, is that as I got to know them more and more, they're, of course, still remarkable in their accomplishments, but they're actually not so remarkable as human beings. That's why it turns out many of them I actually ended up not liking. And so this caused me, it's interesting, in the last 24 hours, I haven't been thinking about it, but it pops up into my head.
So, long teaser, what's the answer?
I don't have an answer, but I will tell you, I don't have an answer. There's not a single person that is not most remarkable. I will, in terms of something much more limited, which is what you were maybe trying to think of, let me just say the scientists I've met. I would probably have to put either Richard Feynman or Murray Gell-Mann. I don't know which. They were very different, but they were both. Most people. One of the other things I've learned is that most people are smart. I mean, most people I know are smart. Many are smarter than me, and so on. But there's a kind of continuum. But you meet every once in a while. You meet someone that isn't part of the continuum. And of course, von Neumann being way out there, a whole quantum leap. And I would say remarkable in this sense about Feynman and Gell-Mann are a quantum leap. They are people that I felt had some deep insight into nature that I certainly would never have. So I would say probably Feynman, actually.
So you witnessed the heroic age of science in the last couple of decades. One of the most extraordinary scientific ateliers in the world. Over those years, the world has changed a lot, including science and the nature of science and the process of science. Where is science heading now, according to your impressions? And when you contemplate its future, are you serene or uneasy?
Well, that's a tough question. I think science has changed. Well, society, as you said, society has changed tremendously in the years I've been involved with science, and science itself has changed. And just one metric of that would be, when I entered the field, it was not uncommon, in fact, it was quite common, that you would have a paper authored by a single author. And many great papers are like that, and many not so great ones. But now, that's exceedingly rare. Everything is, I haven't published a single author paper for probably 20 years, I would say. In fact, since entering...
Is it good or bad?
Well, now I'm just going to answer that. So there's a lot of good in that. That's great, because it means there's greater collaboration and so on. And there's a greater recognition that you need different expertise to do different problems and so on. On the other hand, it mitigates against the lone thinker.
So it's against bravery?
So yes, I think so. It's against taking risk. I think risk is much harder now. The entire academic landscape forces people through the reward system to focus on one thing. It's not just one. I mean, one discipline is not, but it's not even in one sub-discipline. Yeah. But it's within some sub-piece of the sub-discipline, and you typically cannot make academic advancement unless you have something very specific associated with your name. And, that's very bad.
That's how, and that's why the Santa Fe Institute
Yes,
is
so
so
the
special,
Santa Fe
right?
Institute was set up now, it's getting on almost for 40 years, actually, precisely to counteract that, because these extraordinary Nobel Prize winners, almost all of them, felt that this phenomenon was already happening in the 80s, and that some of the big questions that needed to be answered were getting swept under the rug because everybody was focused on something very specific, and that we were no longer encouraging people to take risk, people to take out time and think through things. You had to publish very quickly, and so on. So all of those things have accelerated tremendously since the Institute was founded in the mid-'80s. But it was set up precisely to have a place where that wouldn't be the case, where you would bring people together, big questions, and so on. And just one indicator of that, Murray Gell-Mann, whom I just mentioned, had a program that he proposed in the late 80s, early 90s, called Earth 2050. And it was a concern about the future of the planet, both in terms of its socioeconomic activity and in terms of things like, climate change and so on, all these various questions that have now come up, questions of energy and resource availability. He couldn't get funding. Couldn't get funding in the 80s, 90s. And it had to wait till the early 2000s before suddenly the climate issue became big, and every university in the world suddenly decided they should have an initiative or a center on climate change. But the point of that is that the place was set up to ask such a big question about the long-term sustainability of the planet, because no one was thinking about it in those terms. And so, and now there are what I consider, there certainly are, the big data thing came along, and every university had a big data center suddenly. We had nanotechnology, big nanotechnology centers. Now we have AI. Now AI is qualitatively different and may well be revolutionary, but everything gets focused on one thing, and we have this problem that we need a much bigger vision in order to attack the kinds of problems that the planet is facing in the coming years. And you don't have to believe anything I said. At the end, I should have said, of course, the stuff I did on biology and on cities is pretty hard science. But the stuff I start to talk about the planet is still work in progress. And, a little more, and obviously what I said at the end is more speculative, but you don't have to believe that to know that there are problems ahead. We're facing very serious problems, planetary-wise, and we need some of this bigger thinking, broader thinking, and to encourage young people to do that. And the system is now geared very much against that. And I consider that, in answer to the last part of your question, a serious crisis, not just for science, but for society.
By the way, Brainbar is mostly about promoting knowledge, and for those of you who are interested in all the stuff Geoffrey just shared in his presentation, Santa Fe Institute has a great online course called Introduction to Complexity.
Oh, yeah.
I took that course a couple of years ago. It's amazing. So I recommend that one for everyone. The floor is yours. So I ask the audience members to ask anything. Geoffrey can answer actually 99.9% of the questions existing.
How does this model, what you very convincingly showed us that this is almost universal, how does this explain certain phenomena that, as I feel, don't fit into the model? Yeah. Close to where you live, there is Silicon Valley, which was at its peak, or maybe it's still at the peak, was definitely not the largest city in the US, or not just the largest urban area in the US, and still in a very important field produced extremely high amount of output, whatever that means. How does the model explain this?
No, I'm very glad you brought that up, because I don't have to, in this kind of talk, I didn't have time to make it clear that, first of all, I tried to say it at the beginning a little bit, but I didn't do a good job, that these laws are not like the laws of physics. They're not like Newton's laws, they're not sort of immutable, and they're not precise. They have a statistical component to them, because the thing that's extraordinary is that what it says, so I'm going to lead up to the answer, is that if you give me the size of a city, you mentioned San Jose, San Francisco, in the United States, I will tell you within 10 to 20% accuracy, how many police it has, the length of all its roads, the number of AIDS cases it has, et cetera, et cetera. All these metrics I can tell you, and they'll be correct within 15%, say. The other 15%, here's what's extraordinary about these scaling laws. The other 15% is that is the individuality of the city, its history, its geography, its culture, because it's rather surprising that New York is a scaled-up version of Los Angeles. But it looks completely different. It has a different history. It has a different geography, and so on. But actually it is, in terms of its coarse-grained behavior, up to this sort of 80, 90%. So what you're talking about is that other 10 to 20%, which makes the individuality of a city, and why some cities, a city accelerates or overperforms in terms of high tech. In the case of San Jose, it's San Jose you're actually talking about, the metropolitan areas. That this gives you a framework for saying what it is that is to start asking. You suddenly see that this thing is overperforming. Why? Well, it had Stanford University there, and Stanford was already very prominent in engineering, especially electrical engineering, and so forth. And so this provides a framework for going to the next level down, if you like, of asking about the individuality of each city. So we've actually written papers on this. I didn't want to get, it was not, I was staying at the highest level in this, and I apologize. So in the same way among the animals, I mean, after all, what this says is that despite appearances, a whale is a scaled-up giraffe, which is a scaled-up human being. And that's actually correct at this level. But obviously, if you ask about the length of legs, a whale is, nothing to do with a giraffe, So, but you have to ask yourself, why is a giraffe that way, and why is, well, you do that, and so on. So it's a framework, it's a point of departure for starting to see the various levels and what is important. So, last point here. So if you have a mayor of a city that's there for 10 years, and the population has grown by 10% in that time, and he tells you that the number of patents they produced in the city has increased by 10%, he's doing lousy, because it should have increased by more than 10%. So, or saying that crime, hasn't increased by... These are the metrics you should use to make that comparison, because one of the problems with making comparisons, the only comparison that is typically used is per capita. And what does per capita assume? Everything is linear. And the world we live in is completely non-linear, as we saw. But amazingly, non-linear in an understandable way. So that's the lesson from this. So it's a very important question that you raised.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Regarding the lifespan of the human civilization, what do you think, what's the role of the arms race, the wars, the world wars in this process?
Yes. I don't know the answer to that. What is the role in that build-up? Yes. I don't know. As I said, this is work in progress. In some cases, they could be thought of as leading to a paradigm shift, because they do lead to a transition. There's obviously the First World War and the Second War, the world wars. Local wars probably less so, but I don't know. I don't know the answer.
I have a kid, a Z generation, it's 19 years old. He's worried about, the Third World War.
Yes,
and he's worried about, that it can be solved, by common sense agreements, and we can have another 50 years of peace.
I think the dynamic that's at place now is a dynamic that is extremely dangerous, not just because there's this singularity, but the speeding up of time. We measure time by, the Earth circling the sun and the moon circling the Earth, etc. We use those as our metrics, and they're very linear. But social time is not like that at all. It's getting faster and faster. The day may be 24 hours still, but social time is getting faster and faster. And I don't suppose there's a person in this room who doesn't feel that they can't keep up with their life in some way. You know, and I wonder about most people having to deal with that. So I think a lot of the political, this is now a total speculation, but it's related because you asked about World War III. The political polarization and, I don't know, the political rhetoric that is being used now in some strange way is related to that, is the people feeling they can't keep up, they're left behind, and being lost in some way. And that can lead to World War III.
One very short question.
So you mentioned this sort of low of like very rapid growth and then sort of a collapse and then a cool down period, and that this plays out with companies as well. And I was wondering whether this is a trend that you saw with startups playing out. And if so, are there any companies that actually manage to sort of withstand this sort of cool down or decline period?
Companies are sort of in between organisms and cities. They follow the market. If you just plotted the growth of of companies, there's this continuous little increase. I mean, if you take any of the major companies. But if you were to take out the stock market, just where the average of the stock market, they're flat, basically, most of them. They stay flat. And companies typically outperform the market in the early stages. I took out a whole bunch of graphs on this. All the classic Silicon Valley examples are the ones that are obvious. But they also, one of the things you quickly learn is that the lifespan of a company is very short. Even a publicly traded company, so a company that's already gone through gestation, it's now posted on the stock exchange, so you know it has some credibility. It can only expect to last 10 years. You don't expect any company to last more than 10 years. And half, if you take a cohort at any one time, half will have disappeared in less than 10 years. Now, dying in a company, just to make sure you understand, dying means both the obvious, bankruptcy or liquidation, but also it means being bought up, means being acquired or whatever, which is a death in its own way.
According to your understanding, is immortality possible for biological organisms?
Yeah. And no one in this room is going to live beyond 120. That's it, whether you like it or not. And as you almost certainly know, all the gurus of Silicon Valley especially, but would like to live forever. And there's now an attempt to make immortal. And I would say immortality, meaning, let's say 500 years. Let's call that immortal even.
Then things became boring.
Yeah, I don't think you can live 500 years. I think it may be that you can extend lifespan a little bit, but here's the problem. Is implicit and even explicit in everything I showed, everything is actually interconnected. All those scaling laws for all kinds of weird things all have the same form. They all dovetail into one another, as you do in your body. You know, your body is beautifully attuned to be, you know, everything to happen at the right place at the right time and so on. As I said to someone earlier today, you don't sort of start growing an arm when you're 2 years old on the right, and then 4 years later your left arm grows. Everything grows connected. You're going to do something physiologically, either genetically or physically, to change that. Well, you have that whole problem of unintended consequences. I mean, that's the thing we learned about complex systems. You have a subprime mortgage problem here, and everything seems fine, and then you do something, you go way out on a limb, and the whole bloody system collapses. Who would believe it? You know, the 2008. So that's a typical thing. Or a virus in Wuhan mutates, and there's no football 2 months later in Spain, and there's no flour in England.
That's chaos, right?
That's it. So how in the hell does that, you know, that's incredible. So no one would think that viruses in Wuhan are connected to football in Barcelona. But you know something? They are. Very, very loosely. And most of the time, you'd never know and you don't care. But you start messing around with it, boing, and that's the problem. It's unlikely, but it can happen. So I'm very skeptical about life extension in that sense, lifespan extension, and that.
Maybe that's a good thing.
But
maybe that's a good thing.
I think it is a very good thing.
Okay.
I think you know, 120. Come on.
So, ladies and gentlemen, Santa Fe, New Mexico is a far, far away place. And this gentleman came by friendship, which is one of the greatest honors of my life. But he didn't come alone. There is one amazing person who supports Geoffrey, traveling with him all across the world with us tonight. So please give a huge applause to Jacqueline. The first group.
Actually, you know, when you asked me about the most remarkable person I was going to name Jacqueline.
Yes, absolutely. Please give a warm applause to my friend Geoffrey.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you're great. Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Thanks for watching.